next speaker will be Dr. Sarit Barzilai from the Department of Learning, Instruction, and Teacher Education, the Faculty of Education here at the University of Haifa. Dr. Barzilai has published widely on learners' digital literacy and epistemic thinking, on education in a post-truth world, and on the development of learners' epistemic understanding. Again, at the end of the session, I will post at the chat box links to her academic homepage and Google Scholar page, so you can learn more about her fascinating research. And with this short introduction, I leave open the virtual floor for you, Sarit. Can you share?
I just said thank you, Anon. I want to see now that I can share the right screen. So, do you see the main slide?
Yes.
Anon? Yeah. Okay, so I want to thank you really, Arnon, for inviting me to this workshop. I'm really looking forward to all the talks in the workshop. And in my talk today, I'm going to focus about the role of education in mitigating misinformation and what role education can play. Just a sec. Okay, got it. So I will start by briefly discussing educational responses, current psychological responses to online misinformation. Then I will raise 3 limitations of these responses, and I will argue that addressing these limitations requires educational work. And I will present some suggestions about how education might address these challenges and try to illustrate them using 1 or 2 examples, depending on the amount of time that I have. And I will conclude with a reflection on that will be less optimistic on the possibility of really wide-scale educational change. And I would like to acknowledge my collaborators, Clark Chin and Ravi Duncan. I think Clark is participating here because many of the ideas that I will be presenting here were developed together with them. And I also want to acknowledge the students who participated in the projects that I will show you: Shiri Moragani, Osnat Zohar, Dana Savir, Faiz Abed, Nama Goldik, Ohad Davidov, Ina Telmon, and Talia Shlomi Iluz. So I will not go into definitions of misinformation. I mean, Axel did some of that already. I'm just going to say that I'm going to refer to misinformation as partially or entirely incorrect information that may or may not reflect an intention to mislead. And there's been a lot of work on how to mitigate misinformation, and this work has been recently summarized in an excellent review by Kozireva, Lewandowski, and Hertwig. And if you haven't read it yet, I really recommend reading it. So in this review, Kozireva and colleagues identify 3 types of psychologically informed behavioral and cognitive interventions that can be used to mitigate misinformation: technocognition, nudging, and boosting. So very briefly, technocognition refers to cognitively inspired technological interventions in information architectures, such as flagging misinformation, providing context, or slowing down the sharing of information on social networks. The second category of interventions are nudges. This means changing the design of choices and environments in ways that can reduce misinformation. So, for example, Pennycook and his colleagues have shown in a series of studies that very simple reminders to check accuracy can reduce sharing of misinformation. And they explain that this works because people may share misinformation not because they deliberately want to spread it, but because they are often simply distracted by their social media environments. And the third category of interventions is boosting. So boosts attempt to go further than nudges and to improve people's cognitive and motivational competencies to avoid misinformation. So examples of boosts that are described by Kozireva and colleagues are providing people with what they call simple decision aids for online reasoning, such as telling people to check source reliability and providing inoculation messages that warn people about various types of misinformation that they might encounter online. So these approaches are clearly valuable and have been shown to be effective at reducing misinformation. And furthermore, thanks to their simplicity, they have a greater chance of being implemented on a wide scale. So I think that it makes a lot of sense to pursue them. However, what I want to argue is that the effectiveness of these approaches will always be limited, and specifically that it is limited by 3 conditions that need to be met so that nudges and boosts can make a positive impact. And the first condition is that people have adequate digital literacy competencies and can easily improve these with simple aids. The second condition is that people are sufficiently motivated by epistemic values such as truth and accuracy. And the third tricky condition is that when people are epistemically nudged and prodded, they will tend to prefer the most reliable sources and most reliable information and agree on what these are. And in the next slides, I want to talk about these conditions. I want to problematize them and discuss the challenges of achieving them. So starting with the first condition, I'd like to present some arguments that I developed together with Clark Chin in a recent review paper on educational responses to post-truth phenomena, such as propagation of misinformation, that we published in the last year. So one of the problems that educators are concerned about is a problem that we dubbed not knowing how to know, that is ongoing difficulties in developing learners' digital literacy competencies. And there's really a lot of research showing that there are persistent gaps in people's capabilities to use digital literacy skills and criteria for searching, evaluating, and integrating online information at all ages. And we also know that from many intervention studies that this robustly fostering such skills and criteria can require extended and systematic instruction. And another complication is properly evaluating sources, claims, and evidence often requires a pretty nuanced understanding of the social epistemic systems that produce them, such as science and journalism, and of online communication and miscommunication. And these are topics that are rarely learned at school. So just to give you an example about what I mean about when I say that it's difficult to develop source evaluation competence. So here's some data from a study that I conducted with Clark Chin, in which we examined how adolescents' source evaluation criteria develop over 3 months of inquiry, in which we regularly provided them with scientific information sources that made both correct and incorrect claims and had very different levels of trustworthiness. And we interviewed students every 2 weeks and asked them how good were the sources of the pieces of information that we gave them. And you can see that students mentioned source trustworthiness pretty much right from the start of the study, but they were also, so they were really aware of the importance of trustworthiness. They were not naive. However, their criteria for judging source trustworthiness developed very gradually. So for example, it took them about 3 or 4 weeks to start paying attention to source benevolence, and even longer to consider if information was validated or vetted. So source trustworthiness evaluation competence develops slowly because it's really a very complex task. It requires considering authorship, publication channels, publication circumstances, considering multiple criteria, making complex judgments, and information about sources is often unavailable and needs to be searched for. And even when it's available and really staring students in the face, they can find it hard to interpret. So the second challenge I'd like to talk about is a challenge that we called not caring about truth enough. And this is simply this challenge of commitment to epistemic values. And people's social, economic, political, and other commitments can sometimes outweigh their commitments to accuracy. And particularly, we know that people might not be sufficiently motivated to engage in effortful and time-consuming evaluation processes or in seeking out uncongenial alternative opinions. And also, confusing information environments in which people are flooded with conflicting and sometimes deliberately misleading information might reduce expectancies for success. And lower expectancies for success may further reduce motivation to engage in critical evaluation. So to give just an example of that claim, for supporting that claim, so Pennycook and colleagues report that although most people think that it is important to share accurate information, still about a third of their participants in one of the studies that they conducted admit that they do not think that this is so important. So this is quite a large number. And even more interesting, their prompts to evaluate accuracy had no effect on the perceived importance of accuracy for these participants. So the third thorny problem is a problem of disagreements about how to know, or deep epistemic disagreements in the public sphere. So the problem in a nutshell is that people can disagree not just about the truthfulness of claims, but also about how to find out which claims are true. So for example, different groups can hold different ideals for evaluating claims and sources about climate change and vaccines. And we know that the epistemic authority of science and mainstream journalism and other knowledge-producing institutions is increasingly questioned by various groups. And our concern is that ignoring these deep epistemic disagreements fails to address people's existing epistemic commitments. So just to give one example that might be familiar to you, we know that trust in scientific sources in some issues and some cultures is strongly impacted by ideology, and trusting different sources can result in disagreements about which claims are accurate and which are misinformation. So these problems do not have any simple solutions, but I'd like to argue here that education could potentially address them by fostering students' digital literacy competencies, epistemic values, and epistemic understanding. So in other words, education is necessary for complementing wide-scale cognitive and behavioral interventions. However, unfortunately, current educational practices actually may be aggravating these problems by not paying sufficient attention to digital literacy, by not prioritizing epistemic values, and by ignoring differences in students' epistemology. So addressing these challenges would require rethinking current educational approaches and developing new approaches and practices. So in the next slides, I'd like to highlight some of the ways in which education might address these issues. And these are suggestions that I've raised in collaboration with Clark Chin and Ravit Duncan in the papers that are cited here. So this is kind of like a brief summary. So there's widespread agreement that fostering digital literacy competencies is an important educational goal. However, digital literacy still has an orphan status in the curriculum, and one of the main reasons for that is that it's not usually not integrated within disciplinary studies. So we've argued for a wide integration of digital literacy competencies within the disciplines, so that students have sufficient opportunities to develop their competencies across a wide range of topics. Another problem is that disciplinary studies currently predominantly address expert or insider perspectives on the discipline, and we need to shift more to addressing outsider perspectives. That means preparing laypersons for meaningfully interacting with authentic sources and information despite their bounded knowledge. And this includes developing students' understanding of social epistemic systems such as social media, journalism, and science. So one of the problems with fostering digital literacy skills is that we know that students do not tend to use them outside of the context in which they were learned. So we have argued that to foster commitments to epistemic values and motivation to critically evaluate information, school information environments need to become less epistemically safe. So currently, students rarely have opportunities to encounter untrustworthy, low quality, or conflicting information at school. And this type of information needs to become much more common if students are to develop habits and dispositions for reasoning critically and responsibly. And of course, we and many others have written about the importance of fostering students' dispositional intellectual virtues, such as caring about truth, open-mindedness, carefulness, and humility. And a final important point is that we know from prior work that students may be more likely to adopt epistemic values when they have agency to work on projects that matter to them, and when they are supported in forming social commitments to epistemic norms. To address disagreements about how to know, we have suggested that as students engage in digital literacy activities or other activities that involve knowledge construction and evaluation, they need to be provided with more opportunities for making their epistemic assumptions explicit, reflecting on these assumptions and considering reasons for their own and others' ways of knowing. So such deliberate explorations into knowing involve discourse in which students gradually learn to describe and evaluate the epistemic aims, criteria, and processes that they and other people use to evaluate sources and evidence, to construct arguments, and more. And I hope I will have time to show you a brief example of that in a minute or two. So Anon, I have no, I see that the time is the general time, and I did not take my time. So how much time do I have left?
I'm muted, sorry. You have about 7 more minutes.
Okay, so I think I have time for like maybe one example, and then I'll skip to the end. And if you have more questions about epistemic disagreements, we'll leave that to the Q&A. So I'll show you just one example of a project that we've been working on in my group that I'm going to use it to kind of demonstrate the feasibility of some of these pedagogical suggestions. And this is a misinformation game that we developed in order to foster students' digital literacy strategies and epistemic norms. So games are an attractive way to address misinformation because they can have a very wide appeal. However, prior misinformation games, and most famously the Bad News game developed by van der Linden and Rosenbeek, and go play it if you haven't done so yet, have mainly focused on exposing various types of misinformation and inoculating against them. So, for example, the goal of players in the Bad News game is to be the bad guy and spread misinformation. And this can certainly be fun, but we wondered if it might be possible to do more with games. And specifically, we wish to examine whether it is also possible to use games to teach misinformation detection strategies and to foster knowledge-sharing norms. So we designed a game called Misinformation is Contagious. And like Bad News, the game simulates information-sharing decisions on a social network. But the objective of the game is to acquire followers rather than without infecting them with misinformation. So players get incoming messages on social media about a fictitious pandemic, and some of these are misinformation, and they need to decide if they want to share them immediately and get the most followers, to check them and then maybe share later, and then they will get less followers but reduce the risk of sharing misinformation, or not to share at all. So if they decide to check the information, they can use 3 strategies, and this is a strategy modeling component. They can get more information about the source. They can click on what exactly did the source say and get more context about the original claims, or they can check what other sources have to say and get corroborating information from trustworthy sources. And they can use this information to evaluate the message. Now, if they decide to share and they happen to share misinformation, they get feedback that they have infected their followers with misinformation, and they have this misinformation meter. And if they reach high levels of misinformation, then their followers start to unfollow them because they're really unreliable sources. And we also get inoculation messages explaining what kind of misinformation they had encountered. So we already did 2 studies with this game among 7th and 8th grade students here in Israel. And in both studies, we found that the game had a positive effect on accuracy and sharing discernment of authentic, false and true information about COVID-19 in comparison to a control group that played an epidemic vocabulary game. So players were more attentive to veracity in their accuracy judgments and sharing intentions. And this is an example of results that we got from one of the studies. We also found that the game had a positive effect on students' knowledge about how to identify misinformation, and specifically the players of a misinformation game were more likely to write that they would engage in corroboration in order to identify misinformation about COVID, that they would search for additional information online to check if it's true or not. And students in the control group mainly said that they would check the sources or evaluate the plausibility of the content. So in the second study we did, which had a larger sample, we found that students' knowledge about misinformation detection strategies mediated the effect of the game on accuracy discernment, which suggests the value of this knowledge. The effect of the game on sharing discernment was partially mediated via accuracy discernment, as you might see here. So the accuracy discernment affected sharing discernment, but the game still had a direct effect on sharing discernment, which suggests that gameplay might have had an effect on sharing norms beyond accuracy judgments. So these are promising results, but we do not think that playing a single game, of course, is sufficient. Rather, this game can help start a conversation in class on misinformation and be part of a longer sequence of instruction. So I have a second example here that I will leave. I don't think I have the time for it, so I can discuss it with you later. It's just an example of what epistemic disagreements can look like. So just to conclude, what I've tried to argue here is that cognitive and behavioral interventions can contribute to improving information environments as long as people are sufficiently digitally literate, motivated by epistemic values, and share some common epistemic grounds. And achieving these conditions is not so simple. Educational approaches need to change to better address these goals and not to aggravate epistemically toxic environments. And we have many small-scale examples that demonstrate that this is possible, but whether this can be achieved on a large scale, national scale, is a very big question. So in the past years, I participated in preparing policy documents that was invited by the Israeli Education Ministry to consult on how 21st century curricula and study materials need to be adapted by the 21st century. This document was kind of led by Anat Zohar. And in that document, we made several recommendations that aimed to address some of the issues I raised in this talk. For example, we recommended that digital literacy should be a lateral curricular capability that cross-cuts all the study areas, and that students' epistemic thinking should become a curriculum goal. However, we know that making such changes on a systemic scale is very hard, and it is yet to be seen whether and how such recommendations will be adopted. So that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarit, for this excellent talk. Again, we have 10 minutes for Q&A, and just to remind you, please both use the raise hand feature and put your questions down in the chat box. I understand that some of you had problems with the raise hand feature, so do use also the chat box, and I'll also try to look for you there, but it would be much easier for me to locate people who raise hands, who managed to do so. And one of us put an explanation about how to use the raise hand feature if you're not familiar with the feature. Isaac, you're first.
All right. Thanks so much for your talk, Sarit. I'm really excited about these results, and I'm glad you're studying this in the classroom. Games seem like a really fun educational tool too. I have two questions. One is just an empirical question. How long does this effect last? And since that's simple, I'm just going to ask my second question now, and that's how can we apply some of these results outside of school? I mean, the group of people that I'm most concerned about spreading misinformation are not school-aged people. They are, people my age or my parents' age.
Mm-hmm. Well, regarding your first question, it's a good question. We haven't studied that yet, so this is one of our goals. This is a new game, and we have a lot more to study about it. And regarding your second question, the game is online. And we also have a kind of a web study currently being halted, but we're studying the effect of the game also on adult population. But I kind of fear that we're only getting to the preaching to the choir. I wonder who will actually play this game. So I think that we need to have other tactics to get the game to populations that might need it more and might not necessarily actively seek it out. Definitely. But this is why I think that education is the key, because education is really the place where you can engage students in these activities, and have enough time to do so if you really devote the time to it in the curriculum.
Glenn, Andrea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thanks a lot for this really fascinating talk. My question is also a bit about the approach of kind of educating in schools, which of course I think is a good thing. But my worry is that with digital literacy, that kind of the media landscape and the technological possibilities change so fast that if you learn something like this in school, you just, it will become obsolete. This information will become obsolete really fast. And then you will have a generation of adults who know about digital literacy in their time, but they're not up to date. And as you said, it's hard to get adults to kind of take part in this education. So I was wondering if that's a worry for you.
I don't think there's any magic solution to that, but I think that one of the things that we've been trying to do in my group is we're focusing on very sometimes basic critical thinking competencies. So for example, when we teach source evaluation, we teach things like who is the source, what do other sources say. We teach criteria such as looking at the expertise of a source, the benevolence of a source, and I think that these will continue to remain important evaluation criteria, even if the kinds of sources change. That's one response. And the second response is, we know from another study that conducted by Faiz Abid in my group, who's actually here, I see him. So he compared how students evaluate websites and YouTube videos on climate change. So it could be, very different, looking at websites, looking at YouTube videos. And the striking result from his study is that it's mostly very similar. So critical evaluation competencies are mostly trans-symbolic. I mean, they translate well across symbol systems. And of course, you can have deep fakes and, various kinds of things that you need to attend to differently in videos or pictures or memes or web pages. But some of the basic competencies, cross-cut these for better and for worse.
Thank you.
Next question is from Axel.
Yeah, thanks very much. I was very struck by sort of two remarks in passing you made, which I thought were very intriguing. When you suggested that, in fact, in school and educational environments, it would be good to have, in some sense, epistemically less safe environments, so that people actually get a chance to train their critical skills rather than just always, taking as true what they're told. And I mean, that's in some ways, I think, very interesting, because it also feeds into the question of what norms should guide instructional contexts. And later on, you mentioned that through the game, you can also influence how norms of sharing, and I assume also norms of belief and norms of assertion sort of can be influenced. So I wonder whether, I mean, presumably this is more trying to elicit more of a kind of context. This feeds into some more applied kind of pedagogy.
Yeah. So definitely. So I think there's this amazing study that was conducted with students both in France and in Germany that showed that they gave them source evaluation tasks, and basically they saw that they were making conclusions about these various claims without looking to sources. And then they asked them, okay, do you know anything about sourcing? And they discovered that these students actually knew perfectly well how to evaluate sources, but they did not do it. And when they asked the students to explain, okay, so why didn't you evaluate the sources? The students said, well, the teacher didn't ask us to do it. So it's really not part of a schooling context, but we're supposed to look critically at sources. It's something that you do only when you're asked to do. So I don't think that if you give dedicated lessons, which is what happens, very few lessons, and tell them, okay, in these source lessons, we're going to evaluate sources, and in all the other lessons, we're going to take sources for granted. But you're going to develop good evaluation habits. So there's a question about how to introduce epistemic complexity and make this school environment gradually less safe. So obviously we're not talking about, opening all the windows and letting all the, misinformation flood in. But I think that there are ways to do it through increasingly integrating units in which students need to encounter a variety of sources that can have various levels of trustworthiness, so that they learn, but not everything in the textbook needs to be taken for granted, and develop habits like these. So there's a lot of pedagogical questions about what kind of levels of unsafety you can manage in schools, at what ages, and how you support this. It needs to be supported in some way.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Unfortunately, our time is up, or was up a few minutes ago, and so please join me in thanking both Sarit and Axel for excellent talks.